Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, the Be Mindful channel. I'm your host, Nathalie B. I'm Texas A&M Master Beekeeper, and I work with Les Crowder. And together we try to answer your questions every week. So feel free to jump in either on the YouTube channel in the comments or joining us on Zoom so that you can ask your comments via the comments section. And we'll get started with our friends that are joining us. Today, we're going to talk about honey and how some people, there's a myth out there or practice out there where people are tending to harvest all the honey and just give them something else for the winter, arguing that there's too many impurities and just heavy minerals that clog up their gut, basically. And Les wanted to talk about that tonight. So while I admit the other participants in the Zoom room, he'll get started on the theme and we'll weave in and out questions from the participants. So just make sure you jump in and tell us where you're from and we'll take it from there. Les, the floor is yours.
Good seeing everybody. Nathalie, thank you for organizing everything. I mostly was interested in a comment that somebody had made. Well, honey is really full of minerals. It's not very easy on the bee's digestion. And we should strip all the honey out of the hive and let them overwinter on sugar syrup. That would be healthier for the bees. And I thought, so then bees have been living on honey since the beginning of bees and flowers. Bees and flowers have been working together, mutually benefiting each other for the beginning of time. And now you're saying we should take over. But it turns out it's not the only thing. There's talk about helping bees communicate by making little robotic bees to put in the beehive. As if we need to think for the bees. We need to basically replace the bees with little robots. You know, if we replaced them all with little robots, we wouldn't even need to bother with the sugar syrup. We could just watch the robots dance. And so at any rate, I thought I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and then we can get back to if we have time, the concept of raising queens and making nukes in your own bee yard. But there has to be bees first in order to do that. Real bees, not robotic bees, I guess. So, you know, during the weekend we had a class, and during the class we talked about honey quality a little bit. There are some honey or honey-like substances the bees gather. There's a certain substance that in America we call honeydew, and that's the exudate of aphids that bees will sometimes gather. So if a forest gets a lot of aphids in a certain tree, the tree starts to bleed a little bit at each aphid bite, and the aphids leak a little bit of syrup, and it's sort of sweet. And bees have been known to gather that exudate and make it honey out of it. Now, in Germany, they call the Black Forest honey some of their finest honey. It's very strong, dark. Many people would say somewhat bitter honey. It's considered their finest honey, but in America, we would consider it honeydew because it didn't actually come from flowers. It came from aphids or from the sap of trees that bled as the aphids left a scar behind. And it's been known that honeydew is very high in minerals and can be a little bit hard on the bee's digestion. I made honeydew in New Mexico once. I didn't make it, but, well, hard to say. I moved some bees because the city project, the little town where my parents lived, I had to move them, and we moved them up into the mountains. And there was a lot of aphids on what we call pinon trees, the little pine trees. I think it was kind of a droughty year, they didn't make very good honey. And they made quite a bit of honey during the time when the aphids were real thick in the pinon trees. And it was a very strong, bitter honey. Now, I helped some people with their first honey harvest, and they were like, "Oh, this is so delicious." And I was like, "Well, yeah, it's good." I was trying to be encouraging, but to me, it was it didn't taste good at all. It tasted very bitter and kind of metallic or something. But the bees don't do super well on honeydew. And then all the different honeys from the different flowers have different mineral contents, different sugar types. I remember once reading an analysis of honey. It was considered wildflower honey because it was a mix of a lot of different flowers. Honeybees were mixing it all up in the beehive. And they recognized over 30 different sugars in that honey. Some of those sugars relatively indigestible to humans. Some of them very quickly digestible. Some of them took a few steps to digest. And that's one of the advantages to honey, because when you eat sugar, your blood sugar just goes real high. Then your liver works real hard to take it out of the blood and turn it into glycogen in your liver. And the blood sugar comes down. And you often wind up with low blood sugar. Shortly after when you drink a soda, you get a little bit of a zing out of it. But then you get a bummer, depressed feeling because the liver overshoots, takes too much sugar out of your blood, when it was low blood sugar, and then it kind of bounces around and comes back to normal. Well, that's the reason we shouldn't eat so much sugar, because it's real hard on our liver. It also exposes us to insulin shock, which if we repeat, can aggravate diabetes diagnosis. So honey tends to come in nice and slow, gives you slightly elevated blood sugar, then the liver starts working, does its job, slowly goes back to normal. It's much easier on your blood sugar and your liver and your pancreas and your insulin shock to eat natural honey. Now, if it's better for us, why do we think we should rob it all from the bees and feed them sugar syrup and then couch that as something healthy for the bees? We're doing it for the bees' sake. Never mind that we're taking an expensive product, trading it for a real cheap one, giving the bees a cheap one, we get the expensive one that we get to sell. So there's that kind of potential motivation of just
conflict of interest, right?
Yeah, conflict of interest for sure. Do you really care about your bees? Or you just trying to make as much money as possible?
You're justifying why you're doing it this way. By the way, I want to welcome our apprentices. Brad is on Zoom, and I've got Lolly on YouTube, and I've got friends that are coming every week. So we welcome you, some new people, new faces. Stephen is dialing in from Lohmar, Germany, near Cologne. So welcome. If you have questions, just let us know. Knowing where you're at will help us kind of adapt our answers according to your local conditions. And then we've got on YouTube, we've got Monty from Suburban Sawdusters. We've got James. We've got and Bruce is here. Hey, Bruce, welcome back from Swarmstead Bees and Gardening. It's good to see you guys. And I was kind of reading a comment that Monty made on Zoom, not on YouTube, and he says, this is a good topic. I saw the same statement this week about honey not being good for bees over winter. He says his wife is just a passive beekeeper, quote unquote, and even she thought it was a dumb statement. So yeah, I mean, there might be a reason why those statements are being made. And then yes, that's it. We were talking about Dr. Leo's seminar as well, workshop. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. But Les, great point on that. And I know you sent me that article about the robots. Well, we can get into that a little bit later, but follow the money is what I always say, right? When people are doing something and they're trying to sell you snake oil or justify their behavior, always follow the money. There might be a reason for that, those statements. So,
right. And, the British did some studies many years ago showing that darker honey tends to have more minerals, and that could be considered a good thing up to a point. And because darker honey, the reason they got involved was because they were sweetening tea with it. It was turning the tea a gray color. Turned out that the iron in the honey was mixing with the tannic acid in the tea and making a chelate of iron precipitate, which was a gray color. It isn't terribly beautiful to look at as you're sipping it, I suppose. But the high iron content, I mean, people pay money to get iron in their diet. That's why we eat spinach and so forth, because we want high iron content. So having a higher mineral content is generally considered a good thing. And have we done the nutrition to prove that somehow bees need to be stripped of all minerals and only get sucrose? That's a completely ridiculous statement.
tell us how you
years
feel,
ago,
Les.
years ago, they also used to say, never feed bees honey because you might be transmitting disease. And that's when I was breeding for disease-resistant bees and found it fairly easy to do, to be perfectly honest. I mean, over the course of about 4 years, I got to where I didn't worry about a foul brood anymore. And I had been seeing it intermittently in New Mexico. This was back before we had mites. And I fairly easily got to disease-resistant bees. And I fed them. I even took combs full of dying bees and put them in healthy hives to try to pass the disease on, and couldn't pass the disease. And I fed bees honey all the time. If bees got in a bind where they were going to starve if I didn't feed them, I would buy a 5-gallon bucket of my friend's honey, who let his honey crystallize in 5-gallon buckets, and who I knew didn't treat his bees with, in those days, just antibiotics. And I would just carve out a big old chunk with my hive tool and plop it in the back of a tupper hive, let the bees eat it. And, they thrived. It's silly to think the bees should eat honey. What have they been eating for all these millions of years?
I do want to say, though, it's not the same thing as purchasing honey in the grocery store or potentially from beehives that have been exposed to various kinds of chemicals or anything, right? You don't mean, not all honey is equal, right?
No, that's a good point. That when you get it from the grocery store, you really don't know if you've got honey at all. Or it may be some mix of honey and other things. There was a journalist who did a study, and he got a card from a guy who said, I can get you train car loads and it'll pass all the tests. He said, oh, this is very interesting because I'm a journalist. The guy ripped the card out of his hand and disappeared. He didn't want to be identified. So yeah, you have no idea what you're getting at the store. That's just an unfortunate thing. And even at the growers markets, unfortunately, you can go to a growers market and talk to somebody and they can say they keep bees and this is their honey.
And they might, but it might
honey.
not, yeah, it might not be their honey nonetheless.
Right, well, there was a study done in Boston at the growers market with quite a few beekeepers. Turned out one beekeeper was selling 5-gallon buckets of honey to other beekeepers who had their own bees but quickly ran out of honey and were buying honey from him. And they tested the honey, and the honey he was selling at his table was 50% honey, 50% high fructose corn syrup. The honey he was selling to the other beekeepers was 30% honey, 70% high fructose corn syrup. So even and of course, the people who were buying the honey from him in the 5-gallon buckets and remodeling had no idea what they were selling. And then the people buying the honey from the retail market had no idea what they were buying. So it becomes a real problem. It's so tempting to fake honey, to make fake honey. It's been a problem for a long time.
Right. So, by the way, I want to say hi to Timothy Mitchell, who's coming back from Japan. So thanks for joining us again today. We love having you. I know we chatted on Facebook a little bit, and you said you're hoping to work with bees in Japan as well. You're looking into Japanese hives. And I forget what the channel is that you recommended. That I've seen that video before of that young Japanese lady that's working those worry-looking hives, and she's kind of working it a little bit like a worry. So that was very cool to watch. And Monty in Suburban Sawduster says, "Hey, Swarmstead Bees and Gardening. Bruce is in here, so there goes the neighborhood." And I'm laughing. That's let's just kind of be nice to each other, you guys. It's okay. So honey. We talked about robotics and we talked about honey. And I'm less. Do you have more that you want to add to this? I don't know why I can't talk tonight, so you'll have to kind of do it yourself.
Well, I just happened across an article that showed how somebody's trying to develop a little robot that imitates the waggle dance and supposedly convinces the bees that watch the little robot that it's a bee, and it does the waggle dance in such a way to cause the bees to go visit a flower or a patch of flowers that they designate rather than whatever the bees would naturally look for. And they have no idea if it's going to work. And I'm pretty sure it isn't going to work, because scout bees are constantly looking for flowers, and they may find the flower patch that they're trying to recruit bees to. But they were saying if you knew that a crop nearby was poisonous with insecticide, you could train the bees to go somewhere else. Well, the bees are going to find the flowers everywhere. And they're going to some bees are going to recruit bees here and some there. And it just shows a complete lack of respect for the intelligence of the hive. To think that the bees would all be duped by this little plastic robot bee, and that they'd all go right where that bee told them to and not go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And it's a total lack of respect for nature. Yeah. I just find that nature is pretty fascinating. When you think about the size of a bee's brain, it's literally like a grain of sand. And yet look at all the decisions the bees make, the things that they do. They build that honeycomb in such an intricate pattern. They harvest different kinds of nectar and pollen and manage the brood nest and the population to help them survive through the year and anticipate the future. And they can even do the rudimentary math and so forth that they've shown now. So the idea that somehow we need to give them little robots and convince them not to go to the poisonous field is ridiculous. What we need to do is stop poisoning the bees in the fields. We have to stop using so much poison. And that's going to keep the bees safe. Trying to trick bees with little robots. I can't live in that world. The world that says we don't want nature anymore, we're just going to have little robot bees. Why not just have robot bees do your pollination? Little robot plants. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it's the Matrix. It's Terminator. It's exactly. AI. But, human beings always think that they can be smarter than nature. And it's really, sometimes it works. But for the most part, nature always finds a way. And in this case, we're talking about a superorganism whose complex mechanisms and interactions with its environment and the way they communicate and the way they function, we don't even begin to understand. So we're going to try to help, quote unquote, again, by inserting ourselves into the equation, which might have more unintended consequences that we can realize. And I mean, they already are suffering enough without our help, is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think a lot of our help has caused them to suffer. Not only are they not suffering without our help, sometimes our well-intentioned help is very poorly thought through. We end up doing more damage than good. Miticides and antibiotics are a clear example of, we thought we were helping the bee avoid an infection with antibiotics. And now we realize we're helping the bee get sick with bacteria that we don't have an antibiotic for, because we bred diseases that were antibiotic resistant in the bees. So we were trying to help them in dumb ways, and it backfired on us. And now now they're saying, oh, shouldn't be using antibiotics because we're breeding bee diseases that are antibiotic resistant. Well, now you can't keep bees without miticide. It's the same question. We have to breed bees without miticide. Eventually, we'll find that bees can live without us. And I know that we're inveterate tinkerers. We always have to try things and do things, but we need to keep the basic respect for the other life forms in mind, and respect honeybees, and think through, how is this change going to affect the bee, so that we have to be careful to not negatively affect honeybees' biology with our experiments. And one of our big experiments is pesticides in agriculture. You know, that's not a matter of training the bees not to go to the field to be poisoned. It's a matter of training ourselves how to grow food. And many farmers are figuring out, in restorative agriculture, in regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, they're figuring out how to grow food, make money, and not kill bees. And that's the future of humanity. It's not, let's ditch nature and live in a plastic world. I can't live in a plastic world. I refuse.
So I mean, again, I would say, let's follow the money, right? People are trying to find ways to sell things, which is, probably another reason why they're making those super duper hives, and they're finding those robotics, and they're, creating those solutions to problems that is going to make them money, right? So in the end, it might be a solution to a problem that doesn't even necessarily exist, not that way anyway. But with this being said, we're here to answer people's questions, and I wanted to remind you all to take that opportunity and just ask away. I've got a couple questions in the pipeline. I've got one from James, my friend James, who's saying, don't you usually get light honey in the spring and darker honey in the fall? To come back to the initial theme for tonight. And I would only say personally, it depends, first of all, where you are, what the forage is like, what the season is doing, and what's blooming, really. Les, what's your expert opinion on that question?
Yeah, it really does take traveling around to see where your honey comes from. In New Mexico, we used to make light honey. If we made it at all, it was pretty rare in April from a particular flower. And then light honey again in May with mesquite, and then dark honey in June and July with tamarisk or salt cedar. But in California, they made very, very dark honey in February and March with almonds, and then fairly dark honey with avocado. So it really does depend. Like they would make a lighter honey from acacia trees midsummer. So it really depends on what your bloom is. Each flower has a color and a flavor profile that's unique. Like prickly pear is fairly dark, reddish colored. Salt cedar is fairly dark, slightly greenish colored. Purple sage was a light orange colored honey. And so Cotton that we get here in Texas is the color of water, literally clear. It's thick honey, but it looks like it's a glass full of water. It's clear. So it really just depends on what's in bloom and when the major bloom comes in. And it's easy to be somewhere for a long time and think this is the way it is everywhere else. It takes traveling and meeting beekeepers and then realizing, oh, it really does depend on the flowers and the bloom times of those flowers in the different regions of the world.
Right.
In Phoenix, Arizona, their main dearth is a summer dearth. During December, January, February, they make a huge honey flow on citrus that is a very light, delicious honey. So they don't have a winter, they have what we would call winter, but that's their best season of the year. And in summer, the hot, dry summer is their hard time to get through.
Well, and I was going to say, by the way, that it also depends year to year. You might not get always the same patterns of flowering from year to year, depending on the rains and the seasons. The other thing that to keep in mind is that you might have overlap in mixing of different nectars depending on what's around. That's why we call it wildflower honey, right? It might not be mono-floral. I think that the level for mono-floral is above 30%. Is that right, Les?
I haven't kept track of that in a long time.
Yeah, I think it is. And then the other thing to consider is the amount of fructose and glucose in the various flower nectars, because then you might have honeys that might be more viscous, that might crystallize faster. One of my favorite, for example, is actually in the fall. It's the fake willow coyote, willow poverty weed, whatever. That plant has so many names. But it makes a very light yellow colored honey that's very floral, and that tends to crystallize very quickly but uniformly. So it makes kind of like a spreadable honey that's absolutely delicious, and it does that on its own. And it's a fall honey, so it doesn't mean because it's the fall that it's a dark one. One of our earlier crops where we are is also dark, so sometimes it's flip-flopped. It depends, right, Les?
Right. It very much depends. And it takes years sometimes. There's a honey that I've yet to figure out, that I don't live there anymore. But in the town of Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a certain region of Santa Fe, New Mexico, fairly rural region, they used to make occasionally a very bright red, beautiful, delicious honey that we have never figured out what it came from. It always came in August, and we had various ideas, but we have yet to figure that out. Sometimes, like when mesquite blooms, you can tell that they're really working the mesquite heavy. See a lot of mesquite pollen coming in. And then there's a certain characteristic bright yellow honey that comes in. It's got a mild flavor. And you can, year after year, see that when it doesn't bloom, you don't make that honey. When it does bloom, you do. And you can pretty well guarantee that's mesquite honey. But it can be some of a mystery that beekeepers in different regions have to track down. And what I found is a lot of Texas beekeepers don't keep track of the flowers very well. And then they just call it all wildflower.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then there's always the favorite in our area in the fall when you have the goldenrod blooming and it smells in the apiary. You can smell it when they're dehydrating the honey and the air currents are pushing out the smells. And it smells like sweaty socks, basically. It doesn't mean that the honey tastes bad, but you have all kinds of interesting tidbits about honey that are very local to your area. It's nice to keep track, like Les just mentioned, so that you have a better idea of what's going on and what kind of food your bees are getting. To Bruce's point on Zoom, which I've lost Zoom, there it is. The new product is basically a supplement for amino acids and all kinds of things. It's a brand. And then you have the ones that are selling just pollen supplements. There's all kinds of products out there, all kinds of brands, and they're all pretending to help with honeybee health, solving a problem that might not necessarily be there. Most of the time, the bees feed themselves, and a lot of the research out there has demonstrated that the compilation of researches out there by Emily Nordyke has demonstrated that basically there's no evidence that things like pollen supplements are helping colonies of honeybees in normal conditions and might actually be detrimental to them. So there's things to keep in mind. Every time we introduce a foreign substance in the colony, we stand to introduce unintended consequences and mess with their natural mechanisms. There's feedback loops of positive reinforcement as to go and forage this way, negative feedback loops for stop foraging that area. Every time we intervene and interfere with their communication, their pheromones, their vibrations, their food supplies, we really are throwing them off. And I think that there's always somebody promoting something. And it always reminds me of that snake oil image that, hey, you will feel better with this remedy. They will, thrive with this, but just line up my pockets and we'll be okay, right?
If I may throw in a little bit, the problem is that we begin to breed bees with our treatments, and we actually change the genome because we actually breed bees, for instance, that are antibiotic dependent or miticide dependent or feed dependent, because we take them away from. We breed bees and feed them constantly and feed them extraneous substances. And then we say, this queen's doing a little better than that one. Well, that's the bee that did better on our artificial environment. Mm-hmm. We've done that to cows, right? You can buy a Dexter milk cow. There's a tough little cow that roams around in the grass and eats grass and gives a few gallons of milk a day. Or a gallon. I had a Dexter cow. It gave a gallon a day, which is more than I needed. But you can also breed a Holstein cow that gives 15 to 20 gallons of milk a day, but it's so heavy with her udder is so heavy she can't even walk any distance much at all, and her udder literally drags on the ground as she walks. So that is a cow that's been bred with our artificial environment, and we've bred a cow that does the best it can do for our purposes to make money. 15 gallons of milk a day is a way for us to make money off that cow. But I feel really sorry for that cow. And we could do the same to bees. Mm-hmm. Put them in a little greenhouse, feed them super duper amino acid mix, organic, supplemental, nice, everything, make it sound real nice. And then breed from the bees that did the best in this completely artificial environment with no flowers, and breed a bee that would do okay. But is that the direction we want to go? Do we really want to strip bees from their life with flowers and take it all over and make it something we concoct in a laboratory? That to me is not the way I want to go. I want to live with bees in nature and flowers.
Yeah, respect the animal. Monty says, I'm not sophisticated enough yet to be able to discern between different types of nectars. I just know that I like my honey better than any other, and I freely admit bias. Well, yeah, we all do. And there's nothing better than honey from your own hives that you know, and you know the history of. Grant says, afternoon, Nathalie and Les, well and truly into swarm season here in Australia. Hey, Grant, it's nice to have you. I've been missing you. We haven't been doing the Instagram, so it's nice to see you here. I'm glad to hear that you're into swarm season in Australia, and I'm guessing you might not be in the red zone. Otherwise, you might not be so excited about this. So I hope your bees do well this year, and just let us know. If you have any questions, we'd love to answer as well. Truly nice to have you. Les, what else can we talk about when we talk about basically unintended consequences of our interventions? Honey, Brad mentioned that there's no different than the relationship between plastic foundation and extractors, because once you start getting one, you have to get the other, and it's just kind of pushing for more and more equipment, right? Always in that theme of following the money.
Right, and it's a danger that we have with most of our agricultural universities that do research, because, for instance, Syngenta winds up going to the University of California at Berkeley and saying, we will help you do research, we will sponsor research, we will fund research, we'll even build a laboratory for you at our expense on the campus for your classes. And that sounds wonderful, right? It's leveraging private money to extend the research programs of the university. But by the way, we own all the research, and we get to choose what gets researched and what doesn't. And by golly, it just turns out that everything that we do in our research proves that our products either develops products for us that we own, or proves that our products perfectly healthful and wonderful. And anything that indicates a problem with our product, we don't fund that research. So we wind up with corporate science. And corporate science isn't unbiased science. It has the bottom line, gently but firmly taking the bull by the nose ring and pulling it down to its knees and saying, we get to decide whether this research gets talked about or not. And there's so many clear examples of that. So it's a real danger. And that's where we need more organic research and funding that's not related to pesticide companies.
Yeah, and I want to encourage you to remember to ask your questions, because we can get on our soapboxes and we can just be very opinionated about some of these things. But in the end, we're not trying to sell you anything. We make our money on services, right, for the most part. So we're not trying to sell you, I don't know, treatment-free bees or anything. But in the end, I want to encourage you also to exercise critical thinking every time you hear something, and think of it in the terms of the superorganism. Basically, understanding the biology and really realizing that everything we do to interfere with the superorganism might have some consequences that we don't understand. So the path of least intervention is probably the best for the most part. My friend Grant says he's not in the red zone, he's in St. Andrews. That's right, I forgot. Victoria, I don't know my Australian geography as much as I should. I apologize. But yeah, I mean, educate yourself, figure out the biology of the honeybee, and just kind of follow your instinct. But Les, you told me a few stories, including one that was, I thought, very scary, basically, of a researcher that was presenting some information and he basically got threatened, right?
Yeah, that was Dr. Tyrone Hayes, University of California at Berkeley. He may be retired now, but he might still be there. But he was paid by Syngenta to study the effects of atrazine they were using as a herbicide to kill weeds in a lot of farmland all over the world. And they paid him to prove basically that atrazine was not damaging the aquatic ecosystems when it leached into the little streams and rivers wherever the farms were. And so what he found was just the opposite. He found that very low doses of atrazine were sterilizing male frogs. And so he published his findings without checking in with them because he knew they wouldn't like it. And then they said, oh, what you did is completely illegal because you can't publish anything that we fund without our permission, which was true. He broke a contract but then they said, we're going to have you try again. We're going to fund you one more year, providing you recognize that we get to review it and make sure you did it right. Matter of fact, we'd like to have you line up your experiment and let us approve it before you even perform it and collect your data. And he went ahead and collected and did his work without their permission. And he went to the university lawyer and presented he told him what he was doing. And they said, well, what you're doing is crazy. You're going to lose your funding. You might even get fired. But here's how you should word it if you're going to be really careful, because you want to be, they were trying to help him not get sued. And then he finally got kicked off Syngenta's list. They decided they were not going to fund him anymore. And that's a problem for the university, because they fund a lot of agricultural research. And here's a professor that is destroying some of their funding. But he got funding from a group called Beyond Pesticides. And they were funding him to help him go and talk and promote non-toxic solutions to agriculture. And he was talking at a meeting in San Francisco when somebody came to him at the end of the meeting and said, you know, you got X amount of tens of thousands of dollars of funding from Syngenta. And here you are bad-mouthing them while your wife and kids are home alone on Miller Street. And then the guy just turned and left. And this is before the day of cell phones. So he just dropped everything and went straight home, or called home, and then went straight home. But it really scared him. And it made him realize they're willing to kind of threaten him. And who knows how hard a ball they would play if he continued. It didn't stop him from speaking. I heard him speak in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but it made him much more careful. Right. So it's not just the money funding research. It becomes really serious. It becomes scary at times.
Yeah, that is scary.
He's interfering with millions of dollars. When you step in the way of millions of dollars, it's kind of like stepping in front of a big train. You're in danger.
It's like House of Cards.
Right or wrong, it matters. You get in the way of a big train, and that's dangerous.
Yeah, it's like that scene in House of Cards for whoever's watched that. But it's an American show. William says he's in Hays. I've got a few questions, so we're going to go through those for a while less. I'm in Hays County. I saw the bees this weekend bringing in a lot of white pollen. I looked online and couldn't find much on specific pollen colors in Central Texas. Any idea what they're bringing in? Maybe frostweed, lots of that, and goldenrod right now. So if they have some kind of like hourglass patch of pollen on the back of their thorax, then it might be Himalayan balsam. I've seen that a lot, and that plant kind of like flecks the pollen on the back of the bees. It actually kind of makes them a little bit defensive, which makes sense if they're a little grumpy right now, although we might also have some dearth going on because it hasn't rained in a while. So that I don't know. But Les, what other white pollen would we have at this time of the year?
Well, the Texas sage has an off-white pollen, kind of a creamy white or a slightly pink to brownish white. And then the poverty weed also has a fairly light pollen. So that's a good question. The only real good, easy way to find that would be to go on a walk, take a cup of coffee with your tea or whatever you like, and go out on a walk and just look at flowers and try to catch bees. And I really encourage beekeepers all over the world, but here in Texas, if you could just take pictures of bees on flowers if you can, with your phone or whatever you got. And particularly if you see them with pollen on their back legs while they're on the flower, then we'll all know what color pollen that flower makes. Like purple sage in New Mexico, there's a bright purple flower that makes a very deep red pollen. So when you see that deep red pollen, we could tell it was purple sage. It doesn't have anything to do with the color of the petals. It's the color of the pollen, which might be completely different from the color of the petals. But it just takes getting out and walking around with a camera and educating all of us, and we could all educate each other, because you'll catch bees on flowers that I won't catch, and I'll try to catch bees on flowers that you don't catch. And if we put them into our various groups, like my page on Facebook or Hayes County Beekeepers or whatever, then we'll all learn from each other a valuable thing that can come in handy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then Bruce says maybe it's bone set. I don't know if that's how you say it, but it's a plant that's got white little flowers. Epatorium perfoliatum is the name, but I've never seen that one in where we are. So it's possible. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It kind of looks like a white version of Greg Smith's flower. You know, the little puffy white little flowers at the tip, like all in a clump at the tip of the flower heads. So I don't know, but Richard is asking, in our area in Austin, San Antonio, is it too late to harvest at this point? What if you see that there's some honey, 4 bars frames, but not enough to make it through the winter? Give them more time to build their stores. So harvesting, and what do you do if there's not enough for the bees?
Well, first of all, if you can do a little equalizing, that might be a viable option. You've got one that's got enough to harvest and one that's starving. I might be tempted to take some of the honey from the one that can be harvested and give it to the one that doesn't have quite enough. You don't want to make a bee, you don't want to give a beehive twice what it already has, because they may not be able to patrol the wax moths or hive beetles. But if you give them another comb, if they can get on 5 or 6 combs, they'll make it through the mild winter that we have coming, hopefully. I mean, there's always, it depends, as Nathalie always says. But I would consider that. We just did a little bit of harvesting or equalizing this last weekend. But as we approach deeper into November, I say by November, it's definitely over. And we're getting pretty close. So it's time to get them ready. And ideally, like I just did a harvest for somebody that had quite a bit of honey out in the Elgin area where they were getting a lot of cotton. And we did it right at the perfect time where they were starting to make a little more honey. And that made it easy to harvest without robbing. If you wait till there's absolutely nothing blooming, harvest, you got to get in and out pretty quickly or they start to get robby. And that's no fun for the bees or you or anybody.
Yep, and in that case, we can do what we did for the apprenticeship on Saturday. We ended up closing everybody. We knew we had to do some equalizing, but we're like, we'll come back. We've got to check on the a little swarm / abscond situation, and it'll be better because the bees were getting a little bit defensive and upset anyway. And that might have been because of that swarm / abscond less, right? Because that kind of disrupts the energy in the apiary as well.
Right, but we had so many people in that apiary, and that makes a kind of makes me feel very careful. Yeah, I'm hoping nobody gets stung. And
yeah, we had 2 groups, one with Les and one with me rotating through. Each was about 6 people, I think. So that can add up if we're all in the same area. Monty says, I appreciate that you take questions, but I don't mind just listening and gaining wisdom from Les and you on any bee related topic. Thanks. That's very kind of you to say. James has been very patiently waiting for an answer to his question. Is anyone having problems with Langstroth boxes that have what looks like dovetail corners? All my boxes are splitting all the way across. Gives me incentive to build top bar boxes and keep using those, right? So yeah, Langstroth equipment is tough, right? And one way you can help delay this breakdown of the equipment, which happens very quickly, sometimes because it is square corners It is made out of 1-inch lumber. There's a lot of thermodynamics that make, that wood is very much exposed to the elements. But putting some Tide Bond 3 glue on the corners before you screw or nail them in or staple them in is really going to help with that. But it's not going to be the answer to get to all. So yes, I agree with you. Using Tabar hives is the best way to have less of an issue with your equipment. That's going to last a lot longer, and a little bit of caulk on the edges to fill in the cracks will go a long way as well. But it's basically 5 pieces, 2 2 trapezoids, half of an hexagon, and 3 long pieces. So it's really easy to kind of put together, and it's much cheaper. And because the walls are slanted underneath a rain cover that's also acting as a sun cover, the sun doesn't hit directly onto the wood and the rain doesn't rain on it. So it's going to last a lot longer, especially if you make it in 2-inch lumber instead of the 1-inch that the Langstroth boxes are. And you can make that because you don't need special, precision woodworking skills. You can make that with reclaimed wood. As long as it's not treated or painted inside the hive. So that's something to keep in mind. And as you know, our plans are available for free on our website at bee-mindful.com/plans. So try them out by any means. I've got another question. The William is saying that basically that pollen was on their legs and packed into the comb. There's poverty weed out here now as well. It was pretty white. So maybe that's what it is, right? I mean, there's a lot of that flowering, blooming right now. Are some flowers, let me see if I've got two. Yeah, no, that's it. Brad's asking, are some flowers only visited at certain times of the day? This is a great question, right? Yeah. Because the flowers will generate nectar at different times of the day, which matches some different species of pollinators, by the way, and sometimes they generate nectar again throughout the day, but there is some kind of schedule, right, Les, depending on what kind of flower we're talking about.
Right. What brings this up was, remember when I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I regularly went back and forth from my home to a university campus. And I would pass by this big batch of a certain little weed that we call Gaura, Gaura. And it was bright little flowers. I never saw a bee on it. One morning I got up right around dawn. I was walking just as the sun was actually coming up. And the bees were just humming all over the little Gaura patch. And I came back around 10 in the morning and there wasn't a bee on it. It was still looked just as brightly colored. And it bloomed for several weeks, but it always had bees on it around dawn. And what it turns out is that plants want to get their pollen. Like the Gaura plant didn't want a bunch of dandelion pollen, and it doesn't do it any good. So if the dandelions and the Gaura decide, okay, you take the early morning, we'll take the later morning, then when the bees work, they're working Gaura for a while, and the hive is full of Gaura pollen. Remember that much of the pollination work in a social insect is done in the hive. They go out and they visit all those flowers, and then they come back and they mix together in the hive. They stir that pollen, and they carry it back out. Now they're covered in pollen from all over the whole neighborhood when they're going to their flowers. If they're working Gaura at 6 in the morning, they're exchanging Gaura pollen and carrying Gaura pollen and pollinating Gaura plant very effectively. And then the clock goes to 10 o'clock, the Gaura quits and gives the bees over to the dandelions or the almonds or the peaches or whatever. And so that's the contract between the bees and the flowers that helps the bees pollinate numerous species in the course of a day very effectively without mixing up the pollen quite so much, because they actually work on certain species at certain times to pollinate them more effectively. It's good for the plant, and it's good for the bee, because then the bee says, okay, our schedule is early morning do the Gara, late in the morning do the dandelions. The bees can keep up with all that perfectly well. Yeah.
So, and by the way, that's a good example, illustration of what it is that we don't necessarily know that's happening in the world of the bees, right? Because we can't see that. We can't, see those ultraviolet colors that the flowers have that attract the bees in different ways. We don't know any of that stuff. So that's kind of a good reminder that there's a lot of things that impact the colony and its functioning that if we interfere with, we might do more harm than good. Brad says he's never seen a bee on his snow on the prairie. That's interesting. That might be because you're not looking at the right time, or that might be because they definitely go and feed on that, or they might be because there's better foraging somewhere else that they prefer, right? Because remember, bees are specialized into, they're very efficient, and they like foraging on trees and on bushes better than on plants that are scattered across the landscape, and better than on wildflowers, because it's so much more efficient to forage on that acre in the sky that the tree is. And so that might be different reasons as well. And that's kind of why I like beekeeping, is trying to think critically about what might be doing, causing some of these things, right? So let me see. I've got a question that I missed from Timothy. Actually, he's interested in that mesquite honey. Did we describe it, Les? Did I miss that?
I described it briefly. So in New Mexico, we used to make mesquite in May. Here in Texas, we make mesquite later, more like in June, and we tend to make it for a longer period. In New Mexico, it was about a 2-week period, and that was it. But here, it depends on the rain. Sometimes we make several blooms of mesquite. And the mesquite honey has often a kind of a yellow, a very light colored, very mild honey with a slightly yellowish tint to it, fairly quick to crystallize. So it's a very fine, crystallizes almost white with a very fine crystals. So mesquite honey's got it's a really good honey. I think but I mean, I like dark honey as well. I like the variety, and mesquite's got a wonderful taste.
Mm-hmm. So again, keep in mind that it's based on a certain percentage of that. If you want truly monofloral, and the way that beekeepers are harvesting things like orange blossom honey or guajillo honey or clover honey, is that they will take their bees to those crops when they're blooming, put the new, supers or because usually it's Langstroth people that are transporting those. And then as soon as that crop is finished blooming, they will harvest those, so that they know that's basically only what's in there, or for the most part, what's in there. So this is kind of another way to exploit the way the bees harvest their food to the advantage of a beekeeper. I will say, if you're finding orange blossom in Hays County, orange blossom honey in Hays County, it's not local for sure, because you'd have to go to the coast to find those citrus trees in quantities where they can produce that orange blossom honey. So a lot of beekeepers, we're going to give you all the dirty secrets of the beekeeping industry. Beekeepers that sell a lot of different kinds of honeys with monoflorals and all that stuff, even if it's got their sticker on the bottles, it doesn't mean that it's their honey. Very often they'll purchase buckets and buckets of honeys from even wholesalers for their own wildflower honey, because they don't have enough. Once you start getting into the business of selling honey, very often it can take off really quickly, and people just want your honey because you're a beekeeper. And so I've seen that happen, where you have beekeepers that are buying bulk, and in some cases honey that there's not even produced in their area, and then selling it out as their own. It's true in farmers market and all kinds of things. But I want to remind you also, what I've seen is a guy that was getting his honey. He's getting the honeycombs from a remover, and then crush and strain, and then bottling it and selling it as raw honey, which comes from removal, which is illegal to sell in Texas. So because it could be contaminated with all kinds of things. So that's why it's kind of one of the reasons why I want to keep my own bees and make my own honey, if I can get a little surplus from the bees. But not many people know this kind of stuff, so we're just going to air out all the dirty laundry, guys. Sherry says, last week I mentioned when my picture this app called Havana Snakeroot is also called shrubby boneset. Oh, and mist flowers. So thank you, Sherry, because that's kind of going back to what Bruce from Swarmstead Bees and Gardening was saying about boneset. So that might be part of that white pollen for you, William. So I don't know. Do you guys have any more questions? We've got, well, it's actually 8:30. So with this, we're coming to the conclusion of our weekly chat with the mindful beekeepers. Thank you so much for your questions tonight. Les Crowder is a beekeeper that's an expert that's been doing this for about 51 years. I know, because he's as old as I am. So I'm just kind of always remember how long you've been doing it, Les, for. And it's great to be able to get your expertise, and we're here to answer your questions. So if you like this format, just push like on the YouTube channel and subscribe for notifications on more. Send us your questions and join us every week, or watch the replays on the YouTube channel. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us and for everything, and Les, especially you, for taking the time to share your wisdom as always every week, and taking away from your family time with your beautiful granddaughters to be here with us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nathalie. And thank you, everybody. And we'll see y'all next week. And it's been fun.
Bye, everyone in Germany, in Japan, in Australia, our friends here near and far. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.